Today we're going to go over a simple trick for creating heavy rock guitar tones that let you get the best of both worlds in terms of amp choices while getting all of the aggression and clarity you could ever want out of your guitars. For a song like this one where we don't have a ton of elements going on guitar-wise, getting the tone right here is crucial as every element really shines and will be a lot more apparent if it's lacking compared to the other instruments. One of the most common moves I see used here is stacking amps of various types not only to get a larger tone than the single amp can do, but to create a tone that's more unique to your band's sound and can help you set your guitar tones apart from the crowd. Now keep in mind, not every song or every guitar tone is going to need this treatment, but generally I find myself looking to start trying out different amp stacks when I feel like something is missing from a guitar tone that otherwise would be hard to add with something like an EQ. For example, if the tone just needs to be brighter, I might just boost the highs, but in this case I'm actually looking more so for textures in the mid-range that my main amp doesn't create naturally. This verse riff in particular is actually what caused me to want to start messing around with the stacks, because as you can hear with the main tone, it's just missing a little bit of that bite you would get on something that's a bit more in the Marshall orange amp route, but I really love the tight and punchy low end that the amp provided otherwise, so I didn't want to completely switch things up. This is the main rhythm tone we started off with that I said was missing a little bit of that bite. And then once we add on the second amp, this is what we have. And as you can tell, what it's doing is it's adding some really cool gritty texture to the upper high mids, and it's really filling out that space a little bit, making it seem a little bit less scooped sounding. In this example, I'm using 2 amps from Clairvoyant, but you can totally try this with any of the amp sims that you already own. When it comes to blending amplifiers, one of the most important things to get right is the phase relationship. And don't get me wrong, phase is one of those things you can definitely overcomplicate, but just keep in mind the basics of just flipping the phase when you add on your second amp to be sure that it's getting better and not sounding worse. It's very easy to scare yourself from doing stuff like this because you're scared of ruining the phase, but just keep in mind, all you have to do to check it is just flip the polarity on each of your channels in your DAW and make sure that it's not getting worse when you add it in. I have both of the amps that I'm using on the left channels, and if I flip the phase on here, you're going to hear how the mids get a little bit weird and less direct sounding. That's really what you're listening for, and sometimes if it's really aggressive, you'll actually hear the low end dip out really heavily, and it'll make your guitar sound really weak sounding when they're combined because the phase relationship is actually canceling out a lot of the low end because those are usually the first frequencies to go. So as you can tell, that one's super obvious and you can tell when it's in or out of phase. Some people definitely go a little bit deeper with this and use something like waves in phase or some sort of sample delay so that they can try to get the phase exact. But depending on the scenario, you may not really need to go that deep into it. So like I said in this mix, we have 2 sets of rhythm guitars. We have the high gain rhythms and we have the low gain rhythms here. I'm going to go over both of these tones so you guys can get an idea for what I'm doing in these stacks. So with the high gain rhythm, I really just built this like I would build any rhythm rock guitar that I wanted. I have the gain set appropriately. I have the EQ doing a little bit of tone shaping, pulling back the mids a little bit so I can get the character of the amp that I like. And then I have the tilt actually pushing a lot of low end forward. Think of a tilt EQ kind of like setting an EQ curve on an axis. And pretty much when you pull low end out, you're also adding high end, and it makes for a really natural sound on guitars. So in this instance, I actually was boosting a little bit of low end in, but in doing that, you're going to be pulling a little bit of high end out of it. So that might be where we're losing a little bit of that bite. I then have the overdrive set up here. Pretty simple, just have the level going into it clean. I'm adding a little bit of gain to get a little bit more grit out of the amp. And then on the cabinet, I have IR3 and IR5 selected, and I'm blending and using mostly IR5. And this is the sound that we're using for the high gain rhythms. A pretty simple rock tone, but I think I would lose a lot of what I like about it if I started trying to add high end and taking away from the thickness that it has. And that's where the second amp comes in. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you're adding a second guitar tone in, oftentimes it's not going to be the perfect tone that you would love to hear when it was soloed. And Really what you're trying to get out of this is filling the gaps of the other amps, so sometimes this amp may sound wonky and not necessarily like the coolest tone you've ever heard. In this instance, I'm actually using the purple amp over here, which is our mid-gain amp on Clairvoyant. I have the gain cranked up a little bit, so we're getting a little bit more of the rattiness out of the amp, and I'm pushing the mids forward a little bit, and same with the high end, and pulling back a little bit of lows. Pretty simple moves, they're not doing a ton. And then I also have the tilt actually working in the opposite direction so that we're really getting mostly high-end grittiness out of this amp. On the overdrive section, I just have the overdrive turned on a little bit. Pretty similar settings to the last one, although I do have this gain cranked up a little bit higher, same with the level. I also have a little bit of compression going on with the DI. Really all that's doing is taking those loud notes and kind of pulling them down a little bit so they don't fart out the amp and that we can keep everything a consistent level of distortion. I found especially when I'm adding in texture guitars, it's really important to keep those a lot more leveled out than the mains, just so that they're not poking out weirdly in other spots and kind of making the balance of the tone sound weird. And like I said, when you're adding in that second tone, you really aren't going to try to look to set two great sounding tones and mix them together, because oftentimes that's not going to get what you're trying to actually get out of this. I often recommend turning on the first amp and dialing the second amp while they're both playing so that you can hear how they're working together. And you can also make sure that you're not going to be working against yourself with the phase relationship. And then once you add in the guitars, here's the difference that the second amp can make. And that's really all you need to get started with trying this out for yourself. I hope it helps, and of course, if you have any questions on the process, leave them down below so we can get a discussion in the comments going on amp tones. Thanks for watching, and happy music making.